Thank you so much for being here. We can begin. If you are not muted, if you could make sure to mute, that would be wonderful. And let's get started. So, my name is Hajar Yazdiha. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at USC. I'll be your moderator today. I want to thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation about Dr. Alice Echols' fantastic new book, Black Power, White Heat, From Solidarity Politics to Radical Chic from Oxford University Press. Dr. Echols is Professor Emerita of History and Gender and Sexuality Studies at USC. And joining us today are our two brilliant panelists, Eula Taylor, Professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley, and Judy Tzu-Chun Wu, Professor of Asian American Studies and History at UC Irvine. And just so you know, today's conversation was organized in partnership with the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies and the Hunnick History Department. So our format today is nice and simple, so we can really maximize our time discussing and engaging with this great book. So we'll start with a very short introduction to the book by Alice, and then she'll be in conversation with Dr. Taylor and Dr. Wu for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. And after that, we'll open the floor to questions from everyone. So please be jotting down your thoughts as you're listening to everything, just so we're ready to jump right into Q&A. So without further ado, Alice, huge congratulations again on your wonderful book. Please tell us about it.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone who is here. And thanks to big shout out to Rebecca Lemon, who directs the Levan, and to Zach, who made sure that you all got your registration done and you got your links. Most of all, thanks to Professors Eula Taylor, Judy Wu, and you, Haj Yazdiha, for taking the time to engage with my book. It means a lot to me. So, Black Power, White Heat is my fifth book about the 1960s, and it's about the collaborations between Black and white activists and the Black freedom movement of the 60s. It's a story I tell through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC, and the Black Panther Party, which were two very influential Black-led militant groups that bookend the 1960s. So, what did I find? And I'm going to be brief. I'm going to talk for about 6 minutes. I found that these collaborations made plenty of what John Lewis called good trouble, plenty of it. But I also found that they caused trouble. They were effective, but they were also fraud. Activists found it difficult to escape the very asymmetries of power that they were challenging. And it's also the case, I think, that there were problems of misrecognition, what I at points call making each other up. Part of the trouble also stemmed from the fact that working across the color line was controversial and across the political spectrum. It terrified J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, his worst nightmare, and it also antagonized some Black nationalists. And that opposition would affect both SNCC and the Black Panthers. It also mobilized the closet conservative Tom Wolfe, whose satirical treatment of Felicia Bernstein's legendary 1970 benefit for the Panthers was seized upon by the right, which deployed it very effectively against the movement. Nonetheless, my book, I think, shows that even though solidarity by the early 70s was losing traction, you can still find evidence of it in courtrooms, the very courtrooms where Black radicals were on trial and were getting acquitted and being set free by white majority jurors who believed, or juries who believed that at the end of the day, they trusted Black radicals like Afeni Shakur more than the DAs who were prosecuting them. It's a really fascinating story, that, and one that historians haven't taken on board nearly enough. Which gets me to the interventions of this book. There are a lot of them. I think that my book complicates the historiographical turn called neo-consensus history that treats liberals and conservatives as far more alike than different. Now, let me say, it is true that until the latter part of the 60s, for most liberals, too little was always enough, as Amiri Baraka put it memorably. That said, I think that it's important to situate this timidity in the context of McCarthyism and to take on board the fact that left liberals over time grew a backbone. They actually did. And they came out against the Vietnam War. They came out against the government attacks on the Panthers. And another little wrinkle of this history and the way that it's been written about that I take issue with is the idea that the liberals were the cause of the downfall of the Panthers. I don't think so. I also, in this book, push back against the idea that the movement's most reliable and useful allies were the most radical whites, particularly Weatherman. And Weatherman, as some of you know, have been in the news a lot recently. In fact, the most useful allies were very often the white left-wingers who simply gave money, not the white radicals who competed with the Panthers for bragging rights as to who was the most radical. Relatedly, I argue for the importance of money to movements, something recognized by that pragmatic radical Ella Baker, who was the mother of SNCC and who emphasized the importance of reaching the woman she described as the matron in the fur coat. Finally, I call attention to an idea that was taking shape in SNCC, that activism is most effective when activists locate and understand their own unfreedom, their own stake in change. And I write about this in the chapter that I asked you all to read. And what we find happening there is this idea, which incubates in SNCC, is something that radicals build upon. They build upon this idea to argue that, in fact, they needed to do more than invoke the struggles of peasants and guerrillas in other countries. They also needed to reach out to white people and to reach out to the middle class. Progressives can identify with the oppressed, that's great. But to build a mass-based movement, they also need to connect with their own origins, with their own people. And this is an argument that, I think I make fairly forcefully in the introduction and in what follows. So I'm going to hand it over to my interlocutors. I have my own notebook ready to take notes. And thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so many incredible threads there. Dr. Taylor, why don't we start with you?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm super excited to see 53 people online for this conversation. How lovely, Alice, that your colleagues are supporting you in this way. I love this. I love this. And I so love and enjoy this book. Um, During this political moment, how amazing to have insights that hover around the questions that we're thinking about right now. This past Saturday, as you guys know, we had this massive 80 million plus attendance in the No Kings rallies. And I kept thinking about your book, Alice. I kept thinking about how will future historians parcel out the masses of people as allies, as leaders, as organizers. And what I continued to think about when I read your book is the powerful intimacy of solidarity and allyship, the intimacy of it. We see it with interpersonal relationship. I think Beverly Axelrod is incredibly interesting. I don't know if all of you have gotten that far in the text, but how people begin to how almost impossible it is to disentangle your heart
Mm.
from your political commitments. And I found that so well written on your part. I felt that, you're not romanticizing, you're getting at how people can be drawn in to movements and organizations and relationships based on their own understanding of how they want to be free.
Mhm.
And so I really, really enjoy that part of the book. Um, and for me, the part of the book that I also found so interesting is the role of, these white allies and how their professional skill sets
Mm.
become critically useful and important to both SNCC and the Black Panther Party.
Mhm.
And how, while these professional skill sets and the money that is used to support them in the courtroom and to keep the programs going for the Black Panther Party are important. I think what I found super duper interesting were the challenges and the contradictions and the heartache and the disappointment that all of these people feel, particularly in SNCC, when it came to their commitment to the so-called beloved community, and how people were so committed to the idea found themselves being pushed away at certain moments when Black nationalism moves from the periphery to the center. Um, and it made me have, I think, more compassion for them than I've ever had in the past. And for me, I've done a lot of reading and thinking around SNCC and the Black Panther Party. But your book, as I was talking earlier when we were in our small room, provides a whole new set of teeth on a comb, right? In terms of giving us that small detail and the data around it, in terms of the numbers, that, in my opinion, really, really does shift how we understand SNCC and the Black Panther Party. And so, with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Judy, to just kind of say a few words.
I'm happy to follow on that, but I don't know, Haj, if we should have questions at this point, or if I should also comment and we can ask questions jointly.
Yeah, you know what? We could do that. Yeah, Dr. Wu, if you want to go ahead and offer your comments, and then we'll give Alice some time to respond before we open it up.
Sure. So congratulations, Alice. You're such a model of productivity, of excellent scholarship and compelling narratives. And thank you so much for your most recent contribution, Black Power, White Heat, which really foregrounds the important question of interracial solidarity, specifically Black-white solidarity during the Civil Rights and Black Power eras of the US history. I really appreciate your reminder to examine a range of Black-white interactions, not only in terms of organizing and theorizing, but as you pointed out, in terms of monetary and legal support. Your deep dive into the concept of radical chic is so appreciated, not only because it became this cult and mainstream way to dismiss and criticize white supporters of Black causes in the early 1970s, but that it continues to be a term that has popular circulation in terms of political and cultural discourse. I think your analysis of this time period reminds us of the importance of an integrated approach to history, one that foregrounds social, political, theoretical, and cultural histories. I have some questions for you based on what you've written. So maybe I'll just go ahead and introduce some of these questions now, and then perhaps Eula has some as well. I was also really struck by your depiction of Beverly Axelrod, as well as your discussions of Felicia Bernstein, and really foregrounding the personal impacts of these political forms of solidarity. In Beverly Axelrod, I was fascinated by her fascination of Eldridge Cleaver, the ways in which their relationship with each other evolved both politically, legally, and personally. And I definitely felt the sense of heartbreak as their relationship evolved. One thing that really struck me about your discussion of her as well is that she enjoyed passing and being mistaken for Black. And I was wondering if that was a surprise for you, or if that's something that you knew of from someone, who's kind of living through that time period. And I'm also interested if there are other white allies who had this proclivity towards racial passing, and whether that's something that could be said more broadly about interracial solidarity at that time period. In terms of Felicia Bernstein, I'm just really struck by the line by her daughter in which she talks about the impact of the criticism of their other fundraiser for the Black Panthers, which then became subject to political fodder with this concept of radical chic. And that line is, no one was all the way to happy again, right? It really took an emotional toll on this family that were trying to do what they believed was right. And it just really foregrounded to me the emotional weight of these histories. And I was wondering if you wanted to say more about why it's so important to have the emotional along with what we might think of as movement histories, why it might be particularly important for helping us understand interracial solidarity, and also maybe more broadly about historical methodology as well, like why it's so important to foreground the emotional. I also just had some questions about, your decision to focus on SNCC and the Black Panthers, which completely makes sense, and your decision to focus on, starting in 1960. But I'm also thinking about scholars who've talked about a longer, kind of Black liberation movement. And had you thought about other organizations? Had you thought about a different chronology? I think, again, it makes sense to center Black-white interactions, but it was also a period of multiple forms of liberation, especially with the Panthers inspiring different forms of third world liberation. And so had you thought about maybe a broader cast of characters or racial groups to think about forms of interracial solidarity? So I'm gonna stop there. There's a lot there, so you can decide what you might want to comment on.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your question about the emotional weight that I give to, I mean, my foregrounding of the emotional weight of the story. I mean, I think that we don't pay enough attention to what happens to people in movements. And certainly, as somebody who's chronicled the counterculture, women's liberation, and the freedom movement in the New Left, I am struck very often by the exhilaration that people experience, the thrill of connecting, and the deep despair and woundedness sometimes that they experience. I've written about this in relation to Shulamith Firestone, who was the author of The Dialectic of Sex. And, I am not the only person who has argued, as one activist and scholar has, that human relations are, after all, the marrow of movements. They're like the bone marrow of movements. We have to attend to them. They help to explain why people leave movements, they help to explain why they rededicate. They help to explain all kinds of things. Beverly Axelrod and this whole issue of passing. Yes, I was surprised. I was lucky enough to be able to interview her daughter-in-law. And she told me quite a lot about Beverly, but she did enjoy that. And in that sense, I think I wouldn't want to generalize too much, but I would point out that there were other people like her, including Johnny Otis, the R&B impresario who George Lipsitz has written about. And he was somebody who promoted, he was in a band, he had a band, he also promoted Black musicians, and he passed. He was Greek, he was a Greek American, but he passed, and there were others like them, but there was somebody involved in a version of SNCC here in Los Angeles who was white and Jewish, but very dark. And he too also was able to apparently pass. I don't think we're talking about large numbers of people, but it is something that happened. And I think that particularly because Beverly Axelrod's partner was Black and her office was in a Black neighborhood, that made it even more possible, right? Um, but some of the stuff about Beverly, when one of the white lawyers says to Huey Newton, who has just imparted something secret that he probably shouldn't have told um, the lawyer says, "Why did you tell me that?" And he said, "Well, Beverly said that you were safe, that I could trust you." I mean, she really did have, she was a meaningful partner in that relationship. Um, in terms of why SNCC and the Black Panther Party, um, one of the reasons is that their fates are tangled. You know, SNCC is, first of all, superseded by the Panthers. That's very much the way people in the Panthers see it. And I mean, people in the Panthers and SNCC, I think, see it. And there is an effort to bring these two groups together, right? To merge them or to have an alliance, although the two groups differ about what it is that they're doing. And it falls apart quite disastrously. And over this question, to a great extent, over the question of personality. I mean, when you're talking about Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown in SNCC, and then you're talking about people like Eldridge Cleaver in the Panthers, you're talking outsized personalities, but you're also talking about this issue of separatism and should whites have any role to play in this movement. And that, as much as anything, kept that alliance from taking hold. But yes, I could have looked at CORE. CORE too moved away from the interracialism that he characterized it. But I think that the whole idea of the beloved community was so important to SNCC in the early days, albeit not apparently to Stokely Carmichael, but to most of those people, Black and white, it really did matter. And so for me, it was a kind of ideal case, right? And the fact that they did have a relationship later with the Panthers, and the fact that Carmichael may have been involved in some things that were not helpful to the Panthers down the line. All of that made me want to talk about them together. In terms of the long 60s, which it's true, this isn't a very long version of the long 60s. You know, it begins about 1960, it ends about 1973. I would say, you know, it's already such a long book. And I try to, in some way, kind of point to the longer history through Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Stanley Levinson, those folks. But Victoria Wolcott's recent work, I think, is very useful there in terms of the way interracialism plays out earlier.
There are so many incredible threads here. My heart is just pitter-pattering. I love this conversation so much. Dr. Taylor, do you want to jump in? Do you have any questions that you wanted to pose?
I would just add one question and then we can turn it over to everyone. But my question is about Tom Wolfe. I mean, first of all, I I kept thinking fake news. I just I kept thinking about how, he was, first of all, I had no clue. I think that this chapter is an incredibly important intervention in how we think about journalism and as people who can be an ally or straight up bring you down. And with him, it's like you can't shame him. So that,
No,
you cannot shame him. And I just love the detail of your writing, going back to, how he pushed through with that dissertation, so it was like, he laid the pathway. He clearly showed us who he was from the very, very beginning. And for me, one of the questions that I just kind of felt was hovering around him was his obsession with hypermasculinity of the Black
Hmm.
Panther Party men. His
Hmm.
obsession with it. And what was that about? And, so yeah, that to me was just like the elephant in the room around him. So maybe if you could kind of lean in on that a little bit before we open
Yeah.
it up to everyone else.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's yeah, all of these questions are great. Yeah, one of the things I discovered in his notebook was that his next projected project was going to be on masculinity and the kind of loss, the emasculation of the American man, by which I think he meant the white American man, and in part loss of masculinity too. This was not spelled out, but I mean, it's kind of implicit in both actually an electric Kool-Aid acid test and in Radical Chic, sort of losing out to black men. And I think one of the ways that Tom Wolfe, who was a very conservative man, but nonetheless felt a bond with Ken Kesey, who was sort of headed up these merry pranksters that were experimenting with LSD in California, was around the sense that Kesey and company were seizing the territory of coolness and taking it back from black men who, as jazzmen, R&B men, artists, had succeeded, at least in the world of Bohemia, in seeming to be the most masculine, and instead, with Kesey and company, they very much saw themselves as being cooler than black men. And again, I think that was one of the ways that Tom Wolfe and Ken Kesey, who in a lot of ways didn't share that much, was one of the ways that they bonded. But I do think that Wolfe was obsessed with masculinity, and you can see it in Radical Chic. I mean, was there any woman who actually said those words about the Panthers as real men, not the civil rights men who wear the war suits that were too baggy and were completely sexless, right? These were real men. I I doubt it. I think that was really Tom Wolfe. And it is fascinating. And interesting too that he didn't ultimately go there. And I don't know why he didn't go there with his next project. Instead, it became about the me decade. But you're absolutely right. That was something that he was obsessed about. Okay, I'm gonna open up the chat so I can see something.
Yes, yes. Betsy has a question, and in fact, I think this is a great time to open it up for Q&A. And so, Betsy, you can go first. Do you want us to read your question out loud, or would you like to unmute?
Sure. And greetings, Alice Echols. This is Beth from about 50 years ago in your life. Um, as somebody who's very involved in environmental justice movements now in Appalachia, my question for you is, what do you think are lessons learned in radical movements at that time that are particularly relevant, important for activists and movements now, if
I
any?
don't, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if they were learned by everybody. I mean, I think they were learned by some people. There were people, and I quote one person in particular, Bill Zimmerman, who was involved in a lot of very radical activity, believe you me, not all of which I think he probably disclosed, was a Panther ally. Um, but he realized, he said at a certain point, that nobody had any idea. Neither he nor any of his comrades had any idea how to make this thing called revolution. How would you make that happen? How would you actualize this? What would be the mechanics of it? How would you do it? And he began to realize that this was really kind of a fool's errand. And he began to then work with other people, including Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden, to bring about the Indochina Peace Committee. And it was the IPC that really was behind turning sentiment in Congress against the war and getting a resolution passed to not fund the war. And so it was doing something concrete as opposed to um, simply talking about armed struggle or even doing target practice as some people did. It was actually trying to engage with people and convince them, persuade them, move them over. And so I would say that when I think about this and when I think about, what I try to think about the lessons learned, I mean, I kind of go back to Ella Baker. And Ella Baker's, she was never a moralistic person, and she was never anybody who was going to, nag you, but she was more likely to laugh at you, and not in a mean way. But it was her feeling you had to, and I know this will seem like, this is not exactly high theory here. You have to bring people on board. If you want to build a movement, you have to grow it. And you can't do that by making people feel ashamed of what they don't know, making people feel ashamed of the terms that they don't know that they should apparently be using. You have to have a spirit of generosity, and you have to be incredibly effing patient, I think. Um, and I think, and you have to know kind of what you're up against and if you have it in you. I think one of the most powerful moments of the chapter that I asked you guys to read was Casey Hayden talking about her experience after being in SNCC and finding that so energizing, and then trying to be involved in this ERAP project, working with poor white people and working class white people in an inner city, not in the South. I think it was Cleveland, but it could have been Chicago. And she said, you know, I felt like it was going to take at least 5 years to be able to have any significant impact, and I just didn't have the energy. Because in contrast to Black communities, these were not communities that were oriented around the collective. It was easier with SNCC because collectivity was in some sense there and could be built upon. But in these communities, she didn't see that. So I think, also making room, Betsy, for people who aren't going to do anything more than write a check. That can be important enough. Making room for all kinds of levels of participation. I think that's so important. And hoping that they'll ramp it up, but not making people feel ashamed of themselves and bad about themselves if they can't. Somehow, there has to be a way of being pragmatic and holding on to a radical vision. And I don't think this is easy in practice to move people. I really don't. But I think that's kind of what people need to try to do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's such an important point to make. And I think one of the most radical things about Ella Baker, as you say, is really this idea that she believed everyday people actually knew what was best for them, that we didn't have to come in and tell them because we had PhDs, because we sit up here in the ivory tower, and that you could spend time building those relationships. So I really appreciate that kind of lifting up and amplifying of Ella Baker's lessons for us. I want to allow others to ask questions too. You can click on that react button on your Zoom and raise your hand. But I will selfishly ask a question in the meantime while you are gathering your thoughts. I think this is picking up on a thread that, Dr. Wu brought up, thinking about that question about emotions. You brought up, Alice, too, thinking about like personality types. And then also thinking about what Dr. Taylor said about, kind of the media environment. And I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to bring the structures into the room. I just kept thinking about how you show so convincingly how government repression was at play at every turn. And so it played a huge role in manipulating emotions, in making personalities consequential in certain ways, in ensuring that the media environment was picking up on certain things and sort of fomenting discord. And so I think a lot about, even going to Betsy's question, thinking about like what this means for organizers today. And, we're thinking about a government that has this multi-pronged approach. They use the violence and the incarceration, the infiltration. They're eroding the solidarities from both outside and inside. And so I wonder what you think based on what you saw in the book, if there are any kind of lessons and it doesn't have to be prescriptive, but I think if there's any kind of pattern that you identified in how movements might think about resisting some of those divide and conquer politics that are so effective right now.
So effective. And they were so effective then. I mean, if you think about the Black Panther Party, one of the big problems there wasn't just that there was a personality conflict between Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton. It was also that the government was involved in stoking that and doing whatever it could to make it worse. And they did that across the board, It's some of what they did was shocking, and they enlisted members of the media, including members of the media who worked for the LA Times. They were quite effective in doing that. They tried to circulate stories about Leonard Bernstein's homosexuality. And the media in that case did not play. They refused, journalists refused to put that story out in the world. But this was as punishment for the benefit for the Panthers. I think that today it is so much worse because, back then what would happen would be some FBI agent would write a note, right, to the Black Panther Party headquarters in LA, and would sign it something like, oh, I don't know. I can't remember now if they would sign it Eldridge Cleaver or just some random person, or they wouldn't sign it. But they would do it with Black slang. They were very insistent upon the FBI agents learning Black slang and deploying it to make it seem real. But it would be like one letter or two letters or three letters. Now it's like this social media has made it very, very difficult to distinguish the truth from not. And I think, we saw this, we've been seeing this play out certainly beginning in 2016, if not earlier. The involvement of Russian bots. And, that played a role also in Brexit in England. It's played a role in a lot of countries, this destabilizing of our system, which, of course, listen, our democracy has never been fully formed. It has been far from perfect. But this kind of interference, I think, really does require stepping back, really stepping back and not getting pulled in immediately, because it's very easy to. It's very easy to react and to not really know. And one of the things I didn't say in response to what Eula had been saying about the Tom Wolfe section, which I think also was a great section, I have to admit, is that he did lay the basis for it. I mean, and remember, Tom Wolfe was not a trained journalist. He had a PhD in American Studies. And, I don't want to malign anybody with a PhD in American Studies, but they don't teach you journalistic ethics. And his lack of understanding about what went into being a good reporter is what was kind of shocking. And it was something that shocked a lot of more traditional journalists when he first hit the scene. Interesting that it didn't really bite him. He didn't get much blowback with Radical Chic. Very, very interesting.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to Barry's question that's been in the chat, and then I'll go to Philip and Lana after that, and then we'll go to you, Faith. Barry asks if you could say more about money's role, since that's really one of the book's big revelations.
Money, yeah. Well, money really did matter. And, if you think about what SNCC was trying to do, establishing projects in Mississippi and in other states, in order to make that work, you had to have, first of all, fast cars so you could escape the Klan. This was no small thing. You also had to know how to get out of anywhere you were. You had to know the best route out. But those cars were really important. And in the lead up to the summer of 64, which was Freedom Summer, the black local of Detroit UFW Union um, allowed SNCC to buy at cost um, cars. And so, and I think it was something like 77 cars. Those made a huge difference, a huge difference. But you were somebody who was actually trying to register people to vote and to get people involved in the movement. They could drive long distances every day, and so they needed gas. People in SNCC were paid a stipend. It was a measly one of $10 a week, but they were paid, was it $10 a week or $10 a month? I think it was $10 a week, but it was measly, but nonetheless, as more and more people became involved in SNCC, it was a bigger and bigger drain on SNCC's finances. It was a very expensive proposition trying to run one of those. You look at the Panthers and all that the Panthers were doing. I mean, the Panthers not only had the breakfast program for school children, they had an ambulance service in certain cities. They had transportation service to the nearby prison. It wasn't often, it wasn't that nearby. They had sickle cell anemia testing, health clinics. I mean, they offered a panoply of services. It was part of their survival programs. And all of this cost money. And interesting, I think one of the most interesting things that I discovered was that SNCC really always scrounging for money, despite the fact that for most of its existence, it wasn't nearly as incendiary in its rhetoric as the Panthers, and the Panthers were out there with guns, right? But nonetheless, the Panthers were at points absolutely swimming in money. All of the donations that made their way in because people were outraged by the government repression of the Panthers. And bottom line, when Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were assassinated, that was when the donations went through the roof. People just, and most of it was $5 and $10, or sometimes $1 or $2. But there were also some very big donations. But it made all of those programs possible. And also, you have to think about the bail money, right? And the lawyers. I mean, they required money too. These weren't cases that the ACLU could take. So, one of the reasons I think that the Panthers did begin to, because they had been nationalists of a more standard variety, and one of the reasons they begin to pivot and start to work with whites is that they need legal help.
I so appreciate that. I mean, I think that's really the power of mutual aid.
Yes.
Philip, would you like to go next?
Sure. First of all, I've almost finished reading the book, and I just found it gripping, and so thanks so much, Alice, for contributing so much. So one thing I was fascinated by in the book is the state of the public sphere. Essentially, you're telling a story of a period in which that I remember, in which there was a handful of important, talented journalists, and there was a relative handful of important newspapers, and people read those newspapers who were involved, who were politically engaged, and they looked for those voices. And also in organizational practice, people actually sat in rooms together, had to fly from Los Angeles to New York to sit in the room together with that group of Panthers and so on. And so, I feel like this book is so relevant to today in so many ways and so pertinent and so timely. And yet at other times, I think I'm reading about, it might as well be the 17th century. And, so my question is, uh, how can you say that the lessons of this book can be translated to our situation today, given those vast changes in the public sphere and how people meet and all that stuff?
Well, I think I certainly, the book offers no blueprints, right? I do think uh, personal interaction is very important. I do think that one of the things that I was struck by in reading about Mamdani's campaign was the emphasis that they put on that, on people coming together. And I can't remember if it was playing soccer or what kind of games were involved, but getting people together was a clear aim and achievement of that campaign. I mean, it seemed to work. Um, so I do think, and I take your point about also about sort of public space encompassing newspapers and books. It was a literate society. And one wonders about our own in those terms, even sometimes about our students, because they don't read. Um, and so I don't know quite what to say about that, because so much of sort of breaking through, I think, white Americans' racism, to the extent that it happened through, well, sometimes TV coverage too, to be honest about it, right? Those dogs and the fire hoses, but also reading certain newspapers. And also, I would say the alternative press. That's where the Panthers got their first hearing. It was in magazines like Ramparts and in newspapers like the Berkeley Barb and the Village Voice. The Village Voice was sort of the granddaddy of those kinds of alternative newspapers. But in terms of trying to, I mean, I feel like you do. It does feel like it's several centuries away, not just like 50 or 60 years away. And how you get that back. I mean, I do think face to face is really important. Um, I really do believe that. And however that happens, I don't know the extent to which you can really make movement successfully. I mean, you can announce movement events, but can you make movement successfully on Zoom and in social media? I just I don't know. I will leave that for others, perhaps. I don't know. Haj.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I'm like, from the sociological standpoint, the answer would be yes, but it's complicated. But that's a whole nother session. Lana, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Also, just to chime in, I think that to add to that question, it's like one thing to have movements online, but also can we have movements with the like increased streamlining that nonprofits bring to so much organizing? I was just talking to somebody today who was saying how cookie cutter meetings felt because presentations and standardization and messaging, it's all so easy to standardize and scale, which in a way is good, but in a way really changes the texture of togetherness, even if people are in person. But anyway, thank you for this conversation. I obviously loved reading the book. And I would also say I've had really good experience talking to students about it, having assigned it in my undergraduate class. Alice, I was thinking about what you said, which I obviously really agree with, about how we don't pay enough attention to what happens to people in movements. And one of the things that struck me, particularly in the Radical Chic chapter, is how, and I think you've talked about this also, like beyond the book, but just like the way that the people who were attacked, the rich liberals, the white rich liberals, were not defended, really, that there was a kind of silence from the left. And I think like you talk a bit about it, I think the chilling effect is implicit, but it's so familiar. I feel like that happens all the time now, particularly with like people who are in allied roles who like do something that's seen as cringe, and how there's kind of like the cringe ripple effect means that people just aren't defended very well. now as then. And I guess I just wondered if you had any more to say about that dynamic, particularly if there were things you couldn't put in the book about this.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I don't know if there was any, I mean, there's certainly things I didn't put in the book. That is for sure. But in terms of part four and the Bernsteins and the way in which they were not defended, which is really true. I mean, it's pretty interesting because you can go to the Library of Congress, anybody can access it, and you can see Leonard Bernstein's collection. Much of it is available, and you can see, for instance, that part of the file that deals with Radical Chic, and there is a letter there from Gloria Steinem defending them and telling them, I know you're upset, but basically, don't pay any attention to these people. And, I'm thinking about ways in which you could be defended, who might step up. And so when I interviewed Steinem, I asked her about that. And she said, yeah, I felt really bad about it because I had sort of held it out as a possibility, but ultimately I really didn't know. And then she said, I didn't really know those men. I didn't know the Black men who would be able to push back against Tom Wolfe. And so she said it didn't really happen. And I think that the only person who supported them was, I think, Andy Young released a statement to the press about the attack, but not much more. I mean, they were really on their own. Murray Kempton, I thought, was terrific and said, when you consider, you know, it's pretty incredible when you consider that it seems as though the New York Times was more exercised by uh, what happened at Felicia Bernstein's party than by any of the injustices against the Panthers. It's pretty interesting and telling. But to Kempton, I mean, Kempton basically was, I think, trying to say, hegemony doesn't happen just because of the consent of people at the bottom of the social ladder. It requires the consent of everyone. It also requires the consent of the so-called liberal elite. And I think, one of the things that is scary is the extent to which they were left out in the cold. And the extent to which in our own time we've seen such a capitulation to the right. Now, ultimately, I have to say, the Bernsteins kept fighting. They stayed involved politically. And a lot of the people who were at their benefit continued to go to their benefits and to other people's benefits, and they were not quiet. But in general terms, I think that this came to be understood as something of a charade. What are these people doing, these silly people? I mean, thinking that they can really be allies with these in what Wolfe effectively saw as thugs from Oakland, right? So this idea that these were phony balonies, right? That these were fakers, that they weren't really serious, really took hold, despite the fact that the Bernsteins and a lot of those, and some of those people at least, remained politically active.
Faith Clarkson and Everett Shorey, I'm so sorry we have run out of time for your questions, but I hope you will reach out to Dr. Echols. And thank you so much to Dr. Taylor, Dr. Wu for joining us for the conversation. Thank you all for being here. This has been so incredibly generative. And just a huge applause and congratulations to Alice for this wonderful book. I hope you pick up a copy if you haven't already. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Congratulations
Thank you
again, Alice.